Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the Cherry Audio Mercury-6 tutorial series. The Mercury-6 is an emulation of Roland's Jupiter-6 from 1983, a classic analog synthesizer capable of generating some absolutely magnificent analog tones. I've actually done a performance piece in Cubase. I'll put a link to it above, where I use multiple instances of the Mercury-6 to generate a piece of music. Check that out if you're interested. In this video series, we're going to dive into the thing itself and figure out component by component how it all hangs together. Now, a very brief overview of the synth itself. The Cherry Audio implementation of the Jupiter-6, the Mercury-6, is actually two Jupiters stacked on top of each other. We have this concept called layers. In the key mode section, you can see that we can engage layer mode and we basically double the number of synthesizers. They sit on top of each other. At the moment, we're just going to deal with one of them. This WHL stands for whole, which is basically a single layer representing a single instance of the synthesizer, just to keep things nice and simple for now. And inside each one of these emulations, we've got two oscillators. An oscillator is a thing that makes sound, and in the analog world, they're called VCOs, or voltage-controlled oscillators. Here you can see VCOs 1 and 2. These are the things that are responsible for making the sound. Now, to start with, I've stripped it back even further than that. When I press a key on the keyboard, you're only going to hear the first oscillator generating any tone. If you look in the oscilloscope, you'll see a triangular shape appear. That's called a sawtooth. So let's have a closer look at the VCO, the voltage-controlled oscillator. So VCO1 first. The waveform is the shape of the tone. If I ask it to generate a triangle wave instead, it's going to do that. And as you can see, it's an analog form of a triangle wave. The beauty of analog synthesizers is that you very rarely get straight lines. The next wave type we're going to have a look at is at the bottom of the list. This is called a square wave. And they are three of the four primary wave types that synthesizers can generate. The Mercury-6 can't generate sine waves. Very often analog synthesizers would miss out sine waves because they're not actually very musically interesting. You can't do much with them in terms of subtractive synthesis. The fourth wave shape that we've got available to us, this funny shape, is called a pulse. Now, a square wave that we've just heard is actually a kind of pulse wave. It's a symmetrical pulse wave. If I press a key now, that's the same sound that you just heard. But the thing with pulse waves is that you can vary the width of the on section of the wave against the off section of the wave. It's called a duty cycle. Basically, if you look at the top, how long the wave stays horizontal at the top of its cycle, that's its pulse width or its duty cycle, and we can vary it. To the left of the VCO, we've got pulse width modulation. Lots of acronyms to learn in the analog world. PWM is very common to many synthesizers, and this allows us to vary the width of that wave. I'm going to do it with our pulse width slider. I'm going to press a key. So here's our square wave, which is also a pulse wave. It's basically a pulse wave with a 50% duty cycle. Now I'm going to vary that pulse width. If I take it right to maximum, I'm nearly at maximum, not quite there, the sound will disappear completely. Listen. It's because a flat line, the synthesizer is still outputting a signal. This flat line is basically the signal that it's outputting, but it's meaningless. In order for you to hear any sound out of any system, there has to be a change in air pressure or control voltage in terms of synthesizers. That's not the case here. We've got a flat line, so you don't hear any sound. The moment I pull back from 100%, just that tiny moment in time when the control voltage coming out of this synthesizer is not absolutely consistent, that's what's giving us this tiny, tiny, thin, nasty sound. But for the vast majority of its range, pulse width modulation is an absolutely wonderful thing. Pull it all the way down to square wave again. And there, our on cycle is the same length as our off cycle. So those are the four primary waveform types. Even though sawtooth and square are fundamentally the same wave shape, they're given their different buttons because they have such radically different sounds that it's worth treating them individually. However, the synth does nod to the fact that they are coupled in some way, because you can turn 3 of the waveform types on simultaneously, and now you'll get all of those composite waveforms generated at the same time, resulting in a far more complex wave shape. But as you can see, you can only have one of square or pulse at any given time, because fundamentally it's the same system that's generating that wave. A square wave is just an individual instance of a pulse. Now we'll have a look at the range knob. This is where we determine the fundamental pitch of the note that gets played. So every time I'm doing one of these demonstrations, I'm playing exactly the same note on the keyboard. We'll call it C3, 130 Hertz. That's because currently the range is set to 16 foot. This is a throwback to the days of church organs. It's the length of the pipe that would be required in order to make a note of that pitch. If you halve the length of that pipe, then you now have an 8-foot pipe, and you've just doubled the pitch of your tone. But did you see that as I was moving from 16 to 8 foot, I can jump up in individual semitones. That'll be useful in a moment. Stick it in your memory bank. All the way down at the bottom is 32 foot. So again, pressing the same key. Now we're generating a pitch at 65 Hertz, which is 1 octave below where we started. Obviously, all the way up to very high pitches up here. At this point, I want to bring in oscillator 2. Now, at the moment, everything that you've heard has been just oscillator 1. And the reason for that is because our mixer control, the voltage controlled oscillator mix, is set all the way to VCO 1. If I turn it all the way clockwise, now we're only going to hear VCO 2. Let's see what it sounds like. So apart from the fact that it's set an octave lower than VCO 1, it's actually generating the same tone. They're both outputting sawtooth waves. Let's mix them together, put the control at 50%, and now you'll get that octave split composite of 2 different sawtooths. And in the analog world, nothing is absolutely precise. What you're seeing there is the fact that these 2 oscillators aren't generating their wave, aren't beginning to generate each of their respective waves at exactly the same time, because there's a very slight offset. It's an analog instrument. We can accentuate that difference even further by very slightly detuning the oscillators. VCO2 has this tuning knob, which allows me to detune VCO2 against this stable anchor. VCO1 doesn't have a tuning knob because it's meaningless in this context. It's only a relative control. We're going to detune VCO2 relative to VCO1 and listen to the difference that a tiny adjustment of the tuning knob makes. So here, a completely static wave. Every one of these waves looks identical. And now with just 1% tuning difference, you can see the wave is evolving. Every time we see a different one of these waves, it's slightly different from the previous one. Zoom in a little bit this way. You can see the waves basically morphing and dancing. And that morphing is what gives you that really interesting sound. That's called unison detune. Basically got 2 different sounds that are attempting to generate more or less identical things. Let's push the concept even further and make them generate exactly the same pitch. So they're now both operating at exactly 8 foot. And there, the 1% tuning is manifesting as that wonderful sound. But another very cool thing that you can do with 2 oscillators, if you have per semitone tuning differences between them, I'm going to set one of them to 16 foot. I'm going to double click this control to set my fine tuning to 0. And I'm going to set the range of oscillator 2, 7 semitones above oscillator 1. So basically we're now generating a perfect fifth interval between these 2 oscillators. And that's what this sounds like. Perfect fifths are really great musical tools because most notes of most keys sound good when they're a perfect fifth apart. In fact, in the major scale, B is the only note. If we're playing C major, B is the only note that's actually out of tune. If you play a B, the note 7 semitones above it is an F sharp, and that's not in C major. All the other 6 notes are going to generate something that's in the key of C major. And the the ugly B. Poor old B. Set that back to 16 foot. Oscillator 2 has the capacity to generate noise as well. Now, can you see that as I'm changing these things, you can't turn an oscillator off completely. There's always going to be one kind of waveform in operation. So if I want to turn off noise, I can't press the button, that won't work. Basically need to set another oscillator and then I'll be able to disengage noise. And here's our noise module. As we'll see in later episodes, noise can be really useful as a colouring tool to sit behind other sounds. You can do some really cool and interesting things with it, but we'll stick that in the memory bank for now and come back to it later. Something else this synthesizer can do is a feature called cross modulation. What this basically means is that we're going to use VCO2 as a modulator. In other words, it's going to change the pitch of oscillator 1. This is a process called frequency modulation. VCO2 is going to be the modulator. VCO1 is going to be called a carrier. It's going to do the heavy lifting. It's the one that's generating the primary tone. VCO2 is just there to manipulate VCO1's pitch. Best way to demonstrate this is to set our mixer so that we can only hear oscillator 1. There's our simple sawtooth. Now I'm going to put VCO2 in low frequency oscillator mode. I'm going to turn its range all the way down to low, which means it's now cycling very slowly. If we were to listen to oscillator 2, you can't even determine a discernible pitch. It's cycling so low that it's beyond our ability to hear a pitched tone, and those clicks that you hear are simply the changes in control voltage being applied by the synthesizer. It's not a recognizable pitch. That's not VCO2's job anymore. It's a modulator. Now what I'm going to do is to introduce cross modulation. This manual control on the left-hand side of the cross mod module is going to allow me to basically manipulate the pitch slowly of oscillator 1 over time. Here we go. I'm going to make it even slower by pulling the tuning down of oscillator 2. Can you recognise that shape that it's drawing? It's drawing a sawtooth wave, basically drawing these diagonal lines in the pitch of oscillator 1. It's actually going up, isn't it? It's a sawtooth, an increasing sawtooth. Let's turn VCO2 into a triangle, and then we'll hear smoother modulation. See, I momentarily had both of those oscillators working at the same time. That's not what I wanted. And if I pull tuning all the way down to the slowest possible, it's operating at about a hertz, so it's operating 1 cycle per second, modulating the frequency or pitch of oscillator 1. Now at audio levels, VCO2 is going to have a dramatically different impact on VCO1. So it's now generating a pitch at 65 hertz. And this very almost distorted sound is the pitch of VCO1 being modulated so quickly that we can no longer catch individual modulations. It manifests as this different sound. What you're hearing there is frequency modulation plus. You know, this is the concept that Yamaha picked up in this very year, 1983, was the arrival of the Yamaha DX7, the most famous FM synthesizer there's ever been. And it really introduced a brand new form of synthesis. But here's an analog synthesizer in the same year doing basically exactly the same thing, using one oscillator, VCO2, as a modulator to radically change the pitch and the sound of oscillator 1. So everything that you've heard there has just been VCO1 acting all on its own, but you can mix in VCO2 as well. And you you get this really dramatic kind of dissonance between the two oscillators because they're basically in competition with each other. VCO2 is generating a stable pitch all on its own, but it's also using exactly the same waveform to modulate the frequency of oscillator 1, resulting in these kind of wild and dramatic sounds. Now, I've quite deliberately skipped a couple of controls in the oscillator section because in order for us to understand what they do, we need to talk about other components in the system, and that's what we'll get on to in later episodes. Hope you enjoyed this one. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.